Well, hell yeah. Welcome to the Center for Indigenous Midwifery's podcast. Our mission is strengthening community by honoring, supporting, and reclaiming Indigenous midwifery care and culturally centered family support. For more information on our programming, visit indigenous-midwifery.org, find us on social media, or tune in for a live Zoomcast offered each month. Thank you so much for listening.
Good morning, Zan Hazoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for today. Thank you, Rhonda and Center for Indigenous Midwifery for inviting us as members of the Alaska Native Birthworkers Community to come and share. I've been listening to your Zoomcast for years, and I absolutely love learning and being in community with the folks. And you've done such an awesome job of growing this program. So thank you, Basit. We're excited to be here. Abra, Margaret, and I will be sharing a little bit about ourselves, who we are, where we come from, how we came into birth work, how we began organizing to create the Alaska Native Birthworkers Community. We'll share about what we offer to our community, what our goals, our mission, our vision is. We'll also share about the context in Alaska and why we were inspired to do what we do. And then we'll also invite the opportunity for community engagement. We'd love to learn more about folks who are joining, where you're from, what you're up to in your community, and just do Q&A for the last part of our presentation. In the meantime, we would invite folks who are tuning in to share your introduction in the chat. We'd love to learn who you are, where you're joining from, what called you to this space today, just to get to know a little bit more about you until we get to more of our Q&A. So to start, Zan Hazoon, Lena, Benozalio, Jacob Sauza, Tla'aloga, Hutzan Sadansalit, Degayaka Glizdo, Ina A, Quetzaltuna Buuza, Ita A, Kanias Buuza, Sakun Guichbuk, Buuza, Sadenica, Yadadligats, Yeth Nala Etan, Yeth Sadagatsi, Yeth Saketla, Yeth Anasi, Yeth Sadadza, Habauz. Hi, everybody. My name is Lena Jacobs. My Danaka name is Benozalio. I'm Koikan Athabaskan, originally from the village of Ruby, but I live in Anchorage on Dena'ina territory. I introduced you to my parents, to my husband, to my children. I'll also introduce you, well, she'll give her own introduction, but to my Sada, my older sister, Margaret, on this call. And I know that Margaret has a song that she'd like to share, but I'd like to invite Abra and Margaret to do their intros, and then we can share a little bit more about what drew us into this work as we get into our presentation.
Sure, it's on the Zoom. I'll go next. As Lena just introduced our ancestors and where we're from. So following that flow, Gi'ido Dana Su'uza, Parege Utan Islan, Betsikde Utana Islan, Tla'aloga Utan Sidansilit, Dagaiga Glasto. So as she introduced you all to our ancestors, I also said, we're the people of the place between the two bluffs, or Ruby is a village on the Yukon River in the interior of Alaska. And our clan is Betzik, or Caribou. And that is the place I feel grounded to and call home. And we grew up throughout rural Alaska, primarily in rural hubs, but always returning home to fish camp on the Yukon River with our grandparents. And I'm very grateful that our parents made that a priority for us to spend summers, even though we were living, in different places on other people's lands away from our homelands, that they always brought us home during the summer and made sure we were connected to where we're from. So I'm grateful for that time with our maternal grandparents at Fish Camp, and then also our paternal grandparents who were farmer settlers in Montana. So my Danaka name is Gi'idoidalno, but before that, I guess growing up, my mom called me Binogatsa, which is girl with the big eyes. And later on, as an adult, as our family is, relearning our language and remembering our ceremonies, our family had a naming ceremony, and I received the name Gi'idoidalno after our great grandmother. And the meaning of that name, we don't remember yet, but we chose that name to honor her as she passed away during childbirth. So Gi'idoidalno is the name I'm honored to carry. And then I was also named by Harry Watchmaker, Cree elder, Kiho Mikwan Isquo, which is Eagle Feather Woman. So just wanted to introduce you to all of my names. My partner is EJ David. He's Tagalog and Pampangan from the Philippines, islands now known as the Philippines. We also are honored to live and work on Dena'ina lands in Anchorage, where we're raising our 4 children. They're 13, almost 12, and 10, and then 3. And they were born at home. Our next baby was preterm, and she was born at the Alaska Native Medical Center, and then birth center. And then most recently, our 3-year-old was born in this house where I'm sitting at home. And I'm grateful that Lena was there for me at all of my births, and I'm grateful that Rhonda was with us at my last birth as well. Basi, pass it on to Abra.
Nakpak. Uvangan nungasa kut keagavik mugarunga pat katet kuyagarunga angayukaka Teresa Lu Glen Lu Suli Kagamuk Adadaka Wesley Lu Nasuglu Anaka Nungasuglu Artist Lu. So I'm the granddaughter of Simeon and Susan Putkatuk and Wesley and Artist Pishel, and the daughter of Glenn and Teresa and Simeon. And I'm Anupiak from Utqiagavik from the Putkatuk family. And I live here in Anchorage on Dena'ina land, Anchorage also known as Dagayakuk. And I live with my husband and 2 dogs. I don't have any children yet, but a small dog and husband family. And they might be barking, so if you hear them, they're kind of a disruptive family members as I Zoom from home. I gave them peanut butter treats to try to stay quiet. And I'm just really excited to be here and to share with you all today. And I'll turn it back to Mo.
Yeah, so we're coming to you on a Friday, and it's been a week for a lot of us, as it often is. Personally, and I know this is a shared experience, I'm just feeling heavy from some experiences this week, and thinking a lot about, like, feeling the heaviness and thinking a lot about, like, the systems that we live in that are oppressing us. And I'm really grateful to be in this space with you all this morning, and I want to just take like a few moments maybe to try to shed off some of that heaviness that some of us might be carrying right now, and come into this space together. So this song I found on this album. It was like a Smithsonian CD. I don't remember how I found it. It's called Heartbeat: Voices of First Nations Women. And I was so happy and surprised that there was a recording of one of our elders singing some of our songs on it. And this song, one of the songs I hadn't heard before. And I have been, sorry. I've been wanting to, and I will, been wanting to study it, to learn it and understand it and be able to sing it. But for now, I'm going to play it from my phone for all of us. Sorry, and this is Pauline Carlo from the interior of Alaska as well. And she passed on a few years ago. So that's called Honor Song for an older sister. Sada is older sister. She says Sada, hey, hey, hey. And that's by, that was Pauline Carlo singing it. So grateful to have found that recording. Let's see, so. On to a little bit about how we came into this work. Yeah. So, so personally, like my background was in professional, work background was in community health. I worked in wellness and prevention, centering, Alaska Native ways of knowing, remembering our cultural best practices for how we have kept ourselves well and thriving in this place, since time immemorial. So that's the kind of how I came into this work, through that lens of, again, remembering our best practices for how we care for ourselves and each other, in community and in relation to, the lands and the waters that we come from and live in relationship with. And one of the things I was starting to learn in our tribal health system in Alaska, one of the things I was seeing and starting to learn about was, our main tribal health hospital in Alaska and Anchorage, that a lot of people birthing there are coming from rural Alaska. And often I'm birthing alone. This is really tied a lot to like story of A and BC as well, but a lot of people were birthing alone apart from their communities and support systems. And along that time that I was, learning about this and, learning about our, cultural best practices, I was also beginning to birth my family as well, and going through that transformation of childbirth and, becoming a parent, and experienced, this learning and, an opportunity for healing during that time. It was such an impactful and powerful experience. And luckily, I somehow, found out that there are still midwives in our community. I grew up wanting to be a healthcare provider, but I somehow didn't know that we still have midwives. Like, I thought I wanted to, be a doctor because that was what I knew and heard of and had and saw. But somehow I heard about, this midwifery community in Anchorage, and was like, like starry-eyed, like, oh my gosh, we still have midwives. I thought that was something that our grandmas did. I didn't know it was like still a current practice. And so kind of like made a mental note, okay, like when I start to have babies, if I start to have babies, I want to connect with midwives. And so I was, privileged to be able to find a home birth midwife in my community. And my partner, grew up in the Philippines, and the birth that he was familiar with, just the stories in his family were cesarean birth. So he wasn't really familiar with, other like non-medical births. So it kind of took some time of like talking and building trust to come around to like feeling comfortable with, we were meeting with different, community birth midwives, so out of hospital birth midwives. So for him, thinking about, birth out of a hospital was a little bit scary. But we found somebody that we both felt comfortable with. And when I reflect back on it, she kind of felt like motherly and like nurturing to me. And I didn't have my own mom, with me for that role during that time. And I think that might have been like what I was looking for, but she was very loving and nurturing to both me and EJ. And, throughout our prenatal care, we had really long visits. It was lots of education. And for the first time in my life, she was asking me, for the first time in my life in like a healthcare experience, she was asking me to, research different options for decisions I was going to be asked to make during my pregnancy and as a parent. And I'd never really done that before, like anytime I interacted with the healthcare system, I just kind of like followed along with, whatever was said, to do. And she was asking me to like decide what I wanted to do. And so that was really impactful and a big learning for me. And so we both, learned a lot about birth and grew into parenthood, with that kind of support for learning how to make those decisions. And through that experience, I felt so loved and nurtured, and it helped me to realize some of that like healing potential of childbirth that we'll talk about throughout our slides. And so that really impacted me, and I wanted to do that and be that like with other people as well. And so after my first baby was born, I learned about what doulas are, and alongside my day job and my new baby and family, I think I had like 2 jobs still at that time. But I pursued doula training, and found like a doula training, and went to these trainings and really loved the information, but never really felt like connection or community in those groups. But I could handle it. I was just wanting to get tools and information to like better serve my community, because people, just having shared my story, like people started coming to me asking for me to be alongside them as well during their pregnancy and birth experiences. So I wanted to prepare myself to be able to be alongside people in that way. So I kind of, just by it just people asking, I started supporting people in that way. I never really like said, I was a doula or anything like that. But was very honored to get to start supporting people that way. And so I was doing that alongside my community health work, and then learning about, people birthing alone with a completely, not that experience at all that I described of my first birth. I wanted to start a doula program at our hospital, and started, mobilizing kind of networking different programs and people to come together around this like idea, and like quickly learned it really needed to come from the community, from the community up, not through any kind of like organization. And then meanwhile, I left to go to midwifery school. So that's some of how I came into this work. I never know where, like how far back to start, because I think kind of like, generations have been preparing for us to be here in this moment. But that's a little bit of my story. Sorry, I'm taking extra time. Pass it on to Lena or Abra.
Sure, I can jump in. I feel like so much of my story and Margaret's story is intertwined, because what first brought me into birth work in the way that I show up now was Margaret's first birth. And I was living with her at the time when she got pregnant. And I remember sitting in on some of her prenatal appointments because her midwife would come to the house, and she had books all over the place. So I'd pick up her books and read about them. And I'd ask questions about like the teas and the homeopathic treatments that she was doing for this and that. And I just was so intrigued, and just it completely deconstructed this image of pregnancy and birth that I had had in my mind, informed by the media, and especially the movie Look Who's Talking. If you were born in the 80s or were alive in the 90s and you knew that movie, it's like Christy Alley screaming in a cab, and it's chaotic and it's painful, and it's like nobody knows what to do or how to respond or like how to be present and show up. And it's just like complete mayhem. And it's like this period of loud suffering, and then there's a baby. And I just remember thinking like, that's what birth is like. And then being at Margaret's birth, it was just like so calm and peaceful and empowering, and like controlling the environment and the decision making and the care, which I also had never experienced. Getting lifelong care in IHS, you just kind of like show up, and whatever provider might be there in that moment. you see, knowing that you're probably never going to see them again. And you get your prescription after like, a 4-minute consultation, and then kind of you're out. And it was just a completely different model of care that I had ever witnessed. And her birth was like the most beautiful, transformational experience. And I wasn't even the person giving birth. I was her helper. Like, I was a witness to what she was experiencing. And it was just so impactful. I was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I got pregnant a year later. And Margaret was right alongside me throughout my entire pregnancy. And I was actually on a trip on the East Coast, and I thought I had food poisoning. And I ended up taking a pregnancy test, and sure enough, I was pregnant. And I texted the picture to Margaret of my positive pregnancy test. And within like minutes, I had tons of emails, tons of texts. Well, I mean, I called her too, but my emails were like, books and apps you should get, supplements you should research, how to set up your first appointment. Like from the instant I discovered I was carrying life, like I had this incredible support from my husband, who was right beside me, and then my sister, who doulaed both of us throughout all 3 of our pregnancies. So witnessing her experience getting pregnant for the first time, and I feel really, really like blessed and really fortunate to be able to reflect on my pregnancy and birthing and immediate postpartum experiences with a lot of positive feelings. Like, I really loved all of the experiences that I had. And similar to Margaret, I would share my birth story with people. I think that was one of like the early ways that I became a birth worker, was like sharing my story for people who would ask, or and that just kind of like opened up this opportunity for people to then want to learn more. And then people just started inviting me to come to their births too. And the more that I was learning about other people's experiences, and the more I learned about the differences in the experiences, and heard about like the fear or feelings of disempowerment or anxiety or stress, or not feeling cared for or supported, like the more I realized it was a privilege for me to feel loved and supported and cared for, when really it should be a right. Like, every single birthing person has that right to feel supported, feel well cared for, to feel empowered to make decisions for themselves and for their baby. And I really felt called to like use my privilege, and also honoring our value of reciprocity, and know that like it's my responsibility to try to provide this in my community, because I receive so much love and so much care, and I love this work so much. Like, I want to be able to offer that. Hi, Tala. I want to be able to offer that in our community. So that's really what brought me into birth work. And it was very just through my network. Friends and family would ask me to come. I never had any sort of formal training in terms of like something where I would get a certificate from somebody who had a curriculum. Like, all of my formal training really came directly from the families that I was serving. They taught me so much. And for 15 years, those were my teachers. And Margaret was my teacher, as my mentor. And it wasn't until 2021 that I ever attended the first training for birth work. And that was from other Indigenous birth workers, which we'll share a little bit more about later. So I share that also in response to Belen. I see your comment about struggling with imposter syndrome. And that's certainly a part of my story. And that's something that I thankfully have shed, knowing that insecurity and that uncertainty and that worry or shame, like, it really doesn't belong to us. That belongs to the people who came in and forcefully removed these practices from our communities and tried to invalidate our knowledge and our ancestral teachings and our ways of knowing and caring for our people. And just knowing that there's a reason that I'm here, and I was called into this and I'll show up to share whatever gifts I have. And my gifts look different from Abra's. They look different from Margaret's. They look different from Rhonda's. They look different from anyone who's listening or participating on that call. But it doesn't mean that it's any more or less. It means that we've been called, we're here to serve, and we're showing up in the best way that we can. And if we just set those loving, pure intentions of service and holding space for somebody, then we're the right people in the right place. So that's kind of how I came in, and that's like part of my journey through this. And I'll stop there and pass it over to Abra before we dive more into some more about our organizational birth.
Koyanakpak, Lena and Mo. I knew I wanted to do birth work when I was little, but I didn't like, kind of similar to Mo, like I didn't know what the pathway would be. And then I really knew when I lived in Portland, and I learned more about becoming a doula, and I was able to go to a training. And I grew up, so I'm not Nimipu, but I grew up on Nimipu land in Idaho. And I'm a Nupiaq, and my mom is non-native, she's white. So I grew up with my mom, and then I came home after being a doula for a while, and I came straight home to Utqiagvik, and the hospital there was reopening the prematernal home, and it was perfect timing because I was able to apply. So I was able to live there, and it was so special. I got to live in the prematernal home. I was already a doula, but didn't want to open or start a doula business. Just that was something that was kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around. So then I had this incredible opportunity to be home in Utqiagvik, where my father and all my aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins were, and live with pregnant people in this beautiful home for years. And I absolutely loved it. And Lena and Margaret were at a conference in New Mexico, and I went there and I met them. And Lena's baby, oh, which baby was it though? Lena will have to put in the chat which one. Lena had a little baby, and she was so cute. So we remember by that too, like when we first kind of, when I met them. And it's been really special it was hard. I moved to Anchorage almost 5 years ago, and that was hard to leave my community, but it's been incredible to be here, able to support people from all across Alaska, because like Lena and Mo shared, people are often forced to evacuate their home communities. And so a lot of times if the labor and delivery unit calls us for support, which we'll talk about more later too, I've shown up, and it was someone I knew from home that I had made connections with, and someone who maybe I'd known since she was young, like, because it's been now 10 years since I first got home. So that has been really amazing to be there in that way. And I love being a birth worker. And one of the most amazing things, because I knew in my heart when I was younger, like it was something I was passionate about, but when I did move home and got to learn about family stories, I learned about people in my recent relatives that, see you later, Tala, that were also birth workers and supported people. And that's something we all had in all of our communities. We had people who knew about birth, and like Lena said, there were different roles, and all those roles are so important and so needed, and those skills are so needed. And it's been wonderful, even though it's been hard, like I said, to be away from my home community. It's been amazing to connect with people from home in this way, and it's very fulfilling and wonderful. And I'll turn it back over to Mo.
Okay, so finally this slide, these are the co-founders of the Alaska Native Birthworkers Community. From left to right, there's Stacy Lucasen, Paula, who you just saw on video for a minute, myself, Lena, Abra, Akbik Apuk, and then Stephanie Cromarty. And we're a community-based group of full spectrum Indigenous birth helpers and reproductive justice advocates organizing to reclaim Indigenous birth practices and to support Native families from preconception through postpartum with culturally matched care. So we are serving Alaska Native families representing any number of the 229 tribes in Alaska, and then also other Indigenous families currently living in Alaska. So we currently have 9 Indigenous birth workers on our team, offering free direct and indirect services to Native birthing families. So a little bit about how we came together. I was kind of sharing this already about this kind of system for rural birthing families through the tribal health system in Alaska, and wanting to come together to somehow, try to help support families that are birthing alone, and wanting to start a doula program at the hospital. And so Abra mentioned we met at the Indigenous Women's Health Conference in Albuquerque in 2014. And then we had stayed in touch since. And then in 2017, I was just coming home from midwifery school in Seattle. And while I was down there, was so fortunate and blessed and grateful to find and connect with other Indigenous midwives, Rhonda included. We met at a pre-conference gathering for Indigenous midwives in Albuquerque in 2015. And it was just such a lifeline to meet other people like with this shared experience, because I felt so alone in my midwifery program as a Native person trying to reclaim this education and role that we've always held in our community. So midwifery school was like, I was in like a like fast track kind of like accelerated programs, so it was super intense, like so stressful, traumatizing, and meeting other Indigenous birth workers and midwives was just the lifeline that got me through, along with tremendous support from my family, like my entire family. It was an entire family effort. Like my mother-in-law moved down to Seattle with us to help with the kids while I was gone for like 16 hours a day. But anyway, so this group of Indigenous birth workers that met in Albuquerque in 2015, we connected and started organizing to continue gathering because it was so important. And so we met at that pre-conference space for a few years. And during those meetings, other people stepped forward to host us in their community. And that was so important, visiting somebody on their lands in the context of their community rather than like a hotel conference room was really important. And I offered to host us in Alaska in 2017. And so I was just getting home from midwifery school, like reconnecting with, Abra and, talking to Lena. And anyway, we were able to organize and with the support of the, Indigenous midwifery group that was forming, we were able to host a gathering in Alaska in September 2017. And this is a picture from that gathering. We had around 20 Indigenous birth workers from, throughout Turtle Island, North America, and, connected, built relationships that have been transformative for a lot of us. And from that gathering, Abra was hosting the first Indigenous breastfeeding counselor training on the same dates in Utqiagvik and Barrow. So she wasn't there because she was doing another amazing gathering in her home. But we kind of came out of those gatherings and started just kind of talking, meeting, organizing and volunteering again, like on the side of our, day jobs and other family and community responsibilities. Kind of started organizing an informal, like volunteer pregnancy, birth, postpartum support for people that requested it just by word of mouth. And as we were starting to organize and people were starting to hear about what we were doing, our capacity grew with the demand. And, luckily we were able to meet all of the requests as they were coming to us, just from, scrapping it together from our volunteer network. But over time, Lena started fundraising for our group, and that's been just really changed how much we were able to grow and organize and meet the increasing, demand or request from our community to support them. And so we, like mentioned earlier, now have this amazing group of birth workers, and it's been changing. People are coming as they can, and going on to other things, and we're able to support our time now to do this as contractors. And Lena can maybe talk a little bit more about that structure of how we're compensated as contractors, if other groups are interested in that. But that's kind of how we came together. And again, we're intentionally not through any other organizations, but community-based, and we strive to have a co-leadership and consensus model that we're learning about and trying to strive to for operating as a group. Anything else anybody else wants to say on that?
I'll jump in real quick too, just in case anybody out there is considering how to start your own community birth worker group, or where do you start? So I had run a small company, a consulting business for years, and ended up bringing in ANBC, growing a portfolio for ANBC under the project scope for one of my clients at the time, where they gave me the space and they're like, hey, what you're doing, it aligns with our mission at Alaska Venture Fund of supporting Indigenous-led efforts. If you want to bring that project into your portfolio with your work here, we would really support that and encourage that. So Alaska Venture Fund basically funded my time to start doing some of the fundraising. And then then Alaska Native Birthworkers Community became a project of the Alaska Venture Fund, and we're fiscally sponsored by a national organization called New Venture Fund. And so we do the fundraising for grants. We're almost 100% grant funded. And our fiscal sponsor houses those grants and helps with the fiscal management and the legal compliance and all of that. And then we get to focus on doing the work. So it's been a really nice setup. I know at some point we will outgrow that relationship, because we do dream of having a birth center and other things that will just require a certain level of liability and coverage that would then sever our fiscal sponsor relationship. But we have this set up now, and if folks are curious, we've been really open and tried to be really generous about sharing our model, or sharing lessons learned, or sharing templates. And other folks have been so generous with us. I'm so grateful to all of the Native and non-Native led reproductive justice organizations and doula groups and birth worker organizations that have really taught us a lot about how to do what we do. We set up a lot of like meet and greet calls with folks in our early stages. And even still today, like reach out to folks in our growing network to be like, how do you do this? Or how do you do that? Or what questions do you ask on your intake form? Or who does your insurance? Or we have this legal question. And so it's been a really generous community that has all kind of pitched in to inform how we operate today. And we consistently evaluate ourselves and like ask for feedback and try to reflect on like what worked well in this program that we just rolled out, or what didn't, what can we do better. So we're like in a constant state of evolution and trying to make sure that we're being really responsive to the needs of our communities. So that's all I want to add there. And I'll kick it over to you, Abra.
Oh, already. Okay, thank you. Let me get this pulled up. So this is a little bit about our vision, mission, and values, and we seek to formalize and grow a network of Alaska Native workers who are confident, competent, and grounded in cultural values. Koopy, shh, I'm talking. To support Native birthing families for better health and wellness outcomes for parents and babies, while also advocating for systemic change to better support those families. And we do this through offering, I'm so sorry, they were quiet until I started talking. Hey. We do this through offering our free direct services to families, and also free access to capacity building and trainings for current and aspiring birth workers, and by building partnerships for collective impact on a statewide, national, and international scale. So you can read the vision, mission, and values there. I guess before we go to the next slide, I'll just touch on like our values, our responsibility to community, which we talked about. Alaska's one big community in many ways with lots of different people. So we really are connected. Culturally matched care, a lot of times when families are at the hospital, we might be the only other Alaska Native people in the room. So that's really important to us. And then connection to land and waters. One thing I do, I bring, sometimes if it's like an Inupiaq family I'm serving and I've worked with them, I'll bring a little bit of Salvage Ayu, some of our plant medicines from the tundra, just so we can feel connected, and then upholding ceremony and cultural teachings. And the next slide, I talked about this a little bit on our vision just now, but to go a little more in depth into what we have as our 3 areas of service. And we support Native families with informational, emotional, physical support during preconception, pregnancy, loss, birth, and postpartum. And we also offer community events, which I love, and I'll talk more about that coming up. Childbirth preparation retreats, which have been very special and sweet, and also collection and redistribution of food, maternity, newborn, and breastfeeding support items. So like tangible physical things. And our second area is growing a cohort of trained birth workers to serve Native birthing families in Alaska. And we've been able to offer full spectrum Indigenous doula training and the Indigenous breastfeeding counselor training. And then last October, Rhonda and her crew came up, and that was really wonderful too, to do the childbirth educator training. And our third tier, a focus area is supporting systemic change to better support Native birthing families. So that's kind of collaborating with partners, advocating for better policy. Margaret and I both serve on the maternal child death review committee with the state of Alaska. Margaret and Lena and I were able to do the Association of Maternal and Child Health Program, Healthy Beginnings program, and working to make the systems better is our third focus area. And to talk a little bit more about our community wellness events, it has been so special. I shared a little bit about a retreat. Those 2 images on the bottom of the slide, there's a couple people with their foot in that herb bat. Actually, it was rose and cedar and salt that we were able to make. And then Margaret's demonstrating the placenta and baby with some of the models that we have. So those have been really, really special. We also offer a bi-weekly drop-in visiting circles for families who are at any journey, any point in their journey. So maybe preconception, maybe someone who's suffered loss, or someone who's breastfeeding, or there's lots of people, anyone's welcome who is a Native family in that space. Alaska Native, American Indian, or Indigenous families. And then we have been able to offer the traditional arts and craft workshops. We did a prenatal beaded earring workshop, prenatal nutrition, traditional plants class. We hosted the earring workshop with Rochelle Adams. That was really wonderful. And we also have our traditional knowledge virtual sharing circles. So those have been amazing. And we plan on doing more of those. We were able to do a Yupik, Nupiaq, Dene, and Unangan birthing traditions, cultural sharing circles, and an Inupiaq birth tattoo panel, or Inuit birth tattoo panel. And our goal is really just to have activities for families to do, but also be able to connect them to culture and provide that community space and celebrate our traditions as Indigenous people. And I'm so excited about just expanding that and continuing to do that. And you can find out more information about all of these on our website, and also signing up for our newsletter. So our trainings that we've offered, here we have some images from some of those events. And we were able to offer, like I said, the full spectrum Indigenous doula training, the Indigenous breastfeeding counselor training, and the Indigenous childbirth educator training. And those have just been in the last couple years. And we also have monthly virtual networking circles and skill shares. And we're really excited to just continuing to do that. And it's been amazing to have more birth workers join our team after participating in our trainings. And eventually, we really do want Indigenous birth workers in every community in Alaska, so that people really feel supported and while they're at home, which is what we all deserve, is to have that, like, while we're home, people who know and can support us in our home communities. And so these trainings are open to Alaska Native and Indigenous people who are committed to supporting Native birthing families in their community. And we provide these at no cost, but with the reciprocity being that the people who attend these trainings then will serve Native families and report back to us, so that they're giving back in that way, so they don't have to pay money, but can then serve their community and let us know how it went. And some people who love it just want to deepen their work and continuing to do that, which has been really special to see. And I think I will turn it over to Lena. Or sorry, is it Lena? Yes.
Yeah. So here's our current ANBC birth workers: Abra, Akbik, Delicia Young, all Inupiaq, myself, Katrina Leary, who's Yupik and Athabascan, Lindsay Ernest, who's Chippewa, Laura Young is Inupiaq, Margaret, and then Rebecca Mason, who's also Inupiaq. And part of the thing that's been really cool about kind of this model that we've created, where like we host these training and these learning opportunities, is that like a lot of folks have come into these roles with ANBC because they've come to our trainings and are just really excited about deepening their work, deepening their practice, deepening their service to the community, and end up coming on and getting to do this as their job. So it's been really amazing to see those trainings and growth opportunities grow into now this cohort of people who are out there serving our community. And we're really excited about supporting, although all of us, listed here, we're based in Anchorage and like the nearby Matsu Valley area. But a lot of folks who have come to these trainings are from communities all across the state. There have been 15 different communities that folks have come from, where they were living at the time of the trainings across Alaska. And we've got a growing cohort of folks in Nome and a growing cohort of folks in Sitka. And this morning we just heard that there are folks up in Kotzebue who want to invite us to come up and help work with people in their local communities to really step into this work. So it's been really exciting to see the growth and to be able to support people in their collective journeys, or in their individual journeys, but also as a collective to be able to do this. And just really quickly, just to share about how people access our support. So there's two different ways that people primarily come into community with us. One is somebody who's early on in their pregnancy, or really at any stage of their pregnancy, will submit a birth support request form through our website. And this allows us to kind of meet them in advance, maybe have a few prenatal visits, do a thorough intake, and build rapport with them. And then we match them with at least one birth worker, usually two for backup, to follow them through their pregnancy, be with them at their birth, and then offer postpartum support. But we also have an on-call phone that's monitored 24/7. And all of those birth workers that you just saw, most of us take turns covering the call phone. So every month we go through the calendar and say who can cover call these days. And so when somebody goes into labor and they're in labor, there's a last minute support line that they can reach out to, and we'll be there usually within an hour to support them during their birth and follow up with postpartum care if they'd like that. So we're gonna sort of transition now that we've given you an overview of who we are and a little bit of our origin story. We're going to talk a little bit more about the context and perspective as understood by us presenting as members of the Alaska Native Birthworkers Community about the need for this work, and really dive deeper into why we do what we do, why we exist, what is it that we are sort of working to change and overcome. So I'll pass it back over to myself. Oh, okay, I'm on. I thought I was transitioning to Margaret. So we already talked about the birthright that we have as Indigenous people, as birthing people, in that merely surviving birth is not a high enough bar, that we know that we have the right to not have further trauma inflicted on us during our perinatal care. We have a right to dignity and autonomy, to culturally safe care, to be uplifted and cared for as the sacred beings that we are, as life givers of our creation stories. We have the right not to be shamed and blamed for the ways legacies of trauma are manifesting in our health. We have the right to birth our babies and be surrounded with love, to be free of fear and shame and everything that doesn't serve us, and to start new life surrounded by love and strength and in our own power. And while we know this is a right, it's often not something that's upheld, and that's what we're trying to get back to. And get back to this vision of sovereignty for Native peoples from our first breaths on earth, through the reclamation of our power during rites of passage that are rooted in ancestral knowledge, and each birthing person being surrounded by their community in connection to their sacred lands and waters, or the lands and waters of where they are giving birth, even if it's not their ancestral lands, but still having that connection. And a lot of our work is really trying to call back and uphold this sacred birthright that all of us deserve. This quote on the slide comes from a dearly beloved woman in our community who passed away, known by many as Grandma Rita or Dr. Rita Pitka Blumenstein. She's was a Yupik traditional tribal doctor and a traditional midwife. And this single quote alone just informs so much of why we do what we do. When she shared, "We are our ancestors. When we can heal ourselves, we heal our ancestors, our grandmothers, grandfathers, and our children. When we heal ourselves, we heal Mother Earth." And it's just this beautiful depiction of just how cyclical we are in our existence, and we can go back in time and heal those who came before us, and we can go forward in time and heal those who are coming after us. And this is really inspirational and impactful for us to know that this is important work for us to do. The healing work is necessary for us, and we're not going to be the only ones impacted by the healing work that we're called to do. And this is so important, and we share this quote a lot with the families that we work with, because the care taken during pregnancy and early childhood impact lifelong health for both the child and the birthing parent. And we know that the well-being of the mother is the foundation for the well-being of the entire household, and oftentimes of our communities. And pregnancy is an opportune time to work with families to address healing, because the pregnant person can be especially motivated and open to healing and to positive health changes for the benefit of their child. I know for me, for example, there are things about my own healthcare or nutrition or fitness or whatnot that I neglected when I was just considering myself and my own body. But when I got pregnant, I started paying a lot more attention to what I was eating and learning about ingredients in my foods and learning about the products that I was putting on my skin, knowing that my skin is ingesting all of these toxins, and what products am I using to clean my house. So while I didn't necessarily care about certain things for just me, when I knew that I was carrying another life, I started paying more attention and thinking about what changes do I need to make. And those are physical things, but even emotionally and spiritually, I knew that there were certain things that I experienced, and certain parts of my own history or trauma that I knew I would not pass on to my children. And there were things that I needed to work hard to try to resolve and deepen my own healing in before welcoming children and feeling ready to parent as a healthy parent. We know as Native peoples that there are disparities, and we are often described by people outside of our communities using our disparities as the sole descriptor of our population, that we disproportionately experience this or that. But we know that these health disparities are reflections of racism in healthcare systems, and it means that our peoples are being underserved. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. It doesn't mean that we just happen to continue making a series of individual choices that are causing certain outcomes. We know that our specific Indigenous population disproportionately experiencing health disparities and maternal mortality and infant mortality rates is a result of the system. And that's what we're looking at changing, and changing the narrative as well, not just allowing ourselves to be described by disparities, but describing ourselves and our strength and our power, and reclaiming all of those beautiful things in our community that we know are good for our people, and uplifting the strengths of our communities in this work. because birth work is social justice work. And I really love these definitions that come from the Urban Indian Dictionary, that health equity recognizes we have the answers to solve health disparities. They are carried in our stories, our land, and our DNA. Only when this knowledge is incorporated and valued will we begin to achieve health equity. And historical healing is gathering the pieces broken by historical trauma and stitching them back together in bold, beautiful, intricate patterns of strength and resiliency. So as Indigenous birth workers, we're responsible to our communities, and we are representatives of ourselves and the communities that we serve. And we are advocates in this work. While a big part of what we do is care to individual families, we're also caring for like the collective of birthing people in Alaska. And it ties into social justice. Oops. Okay, so just to give you a really quick overview, if you're not familiar with Alaska, it's a very unique place to live. We have 5 major cultural regions representing more than 20 indigenous languages, more than 200 tribes, and geographically isolated communities that are accessible year-round, only by plane when the weather cooperates, sometimes by snow machine on the river, sometimes by, in the winter, or boats on the river in the summer. But because of our like huge, massive land base and the many, many different communities within the state of Alaska, we have kind of a unique situation in the way that people access healthcare. And approximately 200,000 Alaska Native and American Indian people in Alaska are eligible to receive care through our tribal healthcare system, with 40% of that population living in the South Central region, which runs from Homer to Talkeetna, and where Anchorage, the largest city in Alaska, is located. Part of our worldview and our well-being is interdependent on the well-being of the land and waters that we originate from. And Oscar Coagley was a Yupik scholar who shared this quote here: awareness of the interdependence of humanity with the environment, a reverence for and a sense of responsibility for protecting the environment. And for us, the first environment is the womb, and that's really beautifully depicted in this piece of artwork by Yupik artist Abayuk Moore. And again, Grandma Rita here shares that in order for a person to be whole, they must feed their mind, body, and spirit equally to heal themselves. So this is part of the understanding and the worldview that we bring into our work. And then here's some values. Every different cultural group in Alaska has specific values in their region, but there are also some universal Alaska Native values that we just wanted to share, and also that we try to uphold in our work, and also hold others accountable to, who work in our communities, whether they're Native or not. And we just had to highlight Molly of Denali because we're so proud of this. Just this really beautiful representation of Native people being on screens is awesome. But some of our universal values include showing respect to others, sharing what you have, knowing who you are. Oftentimes when a lot of us are learning our Indigenous languages, the first thing we learn how to do is our introductions. And it's not just, I'm Lena, I'm this and that, I've achieved this and that in my life. It's, I'm Lena, but these are my parents. These are my grandparents. These are my great-grandparents. These are my siblings. This is my spouse. These are my children. We're an extension of our family, and we're defined by our family, by our lineage and our community connections in that way. Accepting what life brings, having patience, living carefully, taking care of others, honoring your elders, and seeing connections. So here's a little bit about some of our Alaska Native values. And from that, we're going to switch to a little bit of a history lesson here to share about certain things in colonial history that have really impacted and shaped the way healthcare is delivered to our community.
All right, Basi, Lena. So this slide is a picture of a river, kind of like a river of life, of several different structural impacts on Alaska Native well-being. And let's see, let me see if I could make my slide a little bit bigger. There's different colors. I'm just kind of explaining what you're looking at. There's different colors of the points along the river of life. The blue ones are, significant moments in Alaska history. Orange is kind of like the development of our indigenous health system, IHS, and the couple of like black points are more like US history stuff. And this is, something we're still continually learning and, understanding some of these things and how they impact us. And just this one slide is, like a semester long course or lifelong course, but we're just going to try to highlight a couple of things. So down on the bottom on the left, like first contact-ish, in Alaska from outsiders was in the 1700s, Russian colonization and the fur trade in the part of Alaska close to Russia. Meanwhile, down in the States, in the 1800s, different 17 and 1800s, different treaties were being made between indigenous nations and the forming like US government. One of those treaties was for healthcare to be provided to indigenous peoples on these lands by the government. And I think it's really interesting that was originally like housed, that responsibility, like under the War Department. So just thinking like of those like structures. Then that responsibility was transferred to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I apologize if I'm like misstating anything. I am not a scholar and have studied these things, but might say things or remember things like that aren't exact. In 1867, Alaska, becomes a US territory. In 1876, there's this missionization in Alaska in this thing called the Comedy Agreement, where the map of Alaska, different churches met around and like literally divided up, sections of Alaska that the churches were going to go, colonize or missionize. In the 1900s, it was described in a really impactful way by the book Yuyurok, Way of the Human Being by Harold Napoleon. He talks about the Great Death, how, the impacts of, epidemics, different diseases that we've never been exposed to, wiping out, entire communities. So, like generations of orphans where we weren't receiving like the teachings and traditional knowledge from our parents and grandparents, because there were like generations like just wiped out. 1920, the Indian Citizenship Act, when Indigenous peoples became citizens of this country. Back to our health system in 1955, the Indian Health Service was formed and charged with providing health care for Indigenous peoples on these lands, and which continues to be like severely underfunded for delivering like adequate care to our communities. Meanwhile, in Alaska, in the 1950s, in response to some of the different epidemics like TB, the community health aid program was formed. So that's when kind of like natural helpers in villages were identified to receive more like kind of like medical care training. So this was like our tribal doctors, our traditional healers, our traditional midwives were kind of like absorbed into this community health aid program, which we'll talk about again, to become the people that were delivering our frontline health care through this like kind of newly developing kind of westernized healthcare system. In 1959, Alaska became a state. There's some other, significant points in Alaska Native history and empowerment. But I just want to point out, nationally in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act made it legal to practice our ceremonies again. So for 100 years, being able to practice our ceremonies was illegal. So imagine how, and I know a lot of people here already know this and live this too. We explain this again mainly for like other people like not from our communities to kind of understand, how like these things impacted transmission of our traditional knowledge and ways of being and survival skills on this land and on these waters, and also our ceremonial practices, with the missionization. And the churches had like a tremendous impact, and then even laws making it illegal to practice our ceremonies. And so we're now trying to like remember those and like piece those back together. Boarding schools, I'm not really going to go too far into this. I feel like we're familiar with the impacts of boarding schools, and again like how disruptive that being removed from our communities and lands and waters for years at a time and away from like those traditional teachings in our families, how that's disrupted the transmission of traditional knowledge. And then just want to highlight in Alaska in 1997, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium was formed, and we took over like managing our own healthcare system, which has been like a really positive change to be, to have to like reclaim that power of managing locally our own healthcare system. So we, receive IHS funding and, and lots of other funding to supplement it, because again, IHS funding is not enough to be able to decide how we want to design and manage our own healthcare system in Alaska. So we can go to the next slide. This is just a little bit on like our understanding and learning about colonialism and colonization in Alaska. So this picture is out, one of those boarding schools, and the sign on the wall in the back, it says, "Do not speak Eskimo," so, we're beaten for speaking our Indigenous languages. So how do you think that impacted, our grandparents and parents raising us in our languages now? And we're again, like now, like working really hard to remember those. And a lot of people, have held on to their languages and cultures and ceremonies, but a lot of people have been, displaced from them. So colonialism is the historical and ongoing policy or practices of acquiring political control over another land, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it. It's just one definition. Colonization is the process of devaluing and dehumanizing Indigenous people, both through formal and informal methods, in order to justify exploiting them on their homeland. So, like the kill the Indian, save the man, quotes. Next slide. So a little bit of a transition. Take a deep breath. It's really heavy stuff. These are just some pictures I found through the Alaska Digital Archives. The picture on the left says midwife at work in Sibunga in 1940, in the 1940s. And then the picture on the right, it was just titled midwife training, and the date was 1951. So just like the contrast, we have traditional healers and tribal doctors and traditional midwives, and then this picture on the right, here's these people unfamiliar with us and where we come from, teaching us how to care for each other. It's just really interesting. So next slide. How colonization has shaped where we birth. Like I mentioned, traditional midwives were, retrained into these non-native medical healthcare systems that were being formed. The evacuation policies, though it may not be like an official policy that's written down, I really love how Karen Lawford talks about hidden policies. For example, if an example would be, if somebody remained in their village and didn't go to, the hospital where they're supposed to birth at in time and give birth in their village, and there's an emergency and a medevac is needed, the insurance, programs won't pay for that medevac. The family will be charged with that. Whereas if they, leave their home to go to the hospital as prescribed, then, the healthcare system will pay for that. So it's, one of the ways birth has been removed from our communities for generations now. And now, this is what we know, this is kind of the system that we follow along in now. So with that removal of birth from the communities, many rural Alaskans cannot receive, perinatal health care or birth with any medical support in their communities. We do have health aides that are trained to know how to take care of somebody during birth in an emergency, but they're not supposed to really be the planned provider for a birth in a village. And some health aides, at a certain level of training can do some prenatal care, but mostly, that perinatal health care is kind of deferred out to other providers and other communities now, the regional, at the regional facilities or tertiary care facilities here in Anchorage. We can go to the next slide. How colonialism has shaped maternity care. So kind of what we've been talking about, our traditional values and knowledge were devalued when new models of healthcare were coming in to our communities, and our people no longer had a place to practice in the same way. Pregnancy, birth, and postpartum care is routinely referred out of rural communities, away from support systems, traditions, and cultural practices. And then also thinking just the impact, the economic impact of, birthing people, women, being removed from communities for extended periods of time, how that affects the local economy. when they can't like fill those essential roles in their communities. All right, so we'll pass it to Abra to describe a little bit of like our current like setup.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mo. So we've talked about this earlier, but I'll talk a little more in depth about this now. And most rural Alaska Native people are giving birth far from home now. And per the Alaska Vital Statistics, there's about 2,000 Alaska Native babies that are born each year. I believe 1,600 of them are born at ANMC. That's the statistic that I'm remembering. Healthy rural pregnant people leave home weeks ahead of time, weeks ahead of their estimated due date to await in a regional hub. And a lot of times they're alone, or they might have to bring their children with them. So they might be alone with a toddler. And about half the births at ANMC are to people who live outside of the Anchorage service area, so further than 90 miles away. And Medicaid insurance does not cover travel for a support person unless the patient is a minor. And in Anchorage, a lot of times people are waiting in patient housing, which is connected to the hospital, but it's a room similar to a hotel room where it's just like one room. It's not really like a community-based center, but more of like an isolated individual space. And a labor support person's travel to get to Alaska Native Medical Center is not paid for by the healthcare system, usually. Sometimes it is. We can switch to the next slide. So where Alaska Native people give birth, this map, there's a map here on the screen that shows Alaska, broken down by region. And then there's also an Alaska outline laid over, oh no, my dog's laid over the United States. And to see just how big, like it stretches, just the Aleutians stretch like more than halfway across the lower 48, the contiguous United States. And an example for the distance is that the distance from Atka to Anchorage is 1,102 miles, and Metlakatla to Anchorage is 1,193 miles, air miles. And some Alaskans travel further to give birth than the distance from Seattle to Tijuana, which is 1,066 miles. And the hubs, there's Utqiagvik, Nome, Bethel, Fairbanks, Kodiak, Sitka. Those are the place where there's hubs. There's still hospitals there, so people can give birth there, but a lot of times they're still sent to Anchorage. Dillingham did have a hospital, but they closed their labor and delivery unit in the last few years. So the next slide is a little bit more about where Alaska Native people give birth. So this graph shows the number of rural versus urban tribal health system births between 1990 and 2021. The blue line's the number of births of all the regional tribal health facilities combined, and the red line's the number of births at the tertiary care tribal health facility, ANMC, or Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage. And you can see on this graph that the proportion of births at ANMC has grown relative to those in regional hubs. So the maternal and infant mortality rates for all Americans did drop from the 1950s to the late 80s. The dislocation from home community for Indigenous pregnant people is common practice in Alaska. And giving birth alone, far from home, far from our support systems, family, and partners, is not expected of almost anyone else, but it's a standard of care for rural Alaska Native people. And there's another image on here of Stephanie, our co-founder Stephanie, with one of her babies. Okay, so the next slide, and this is where I mentioned prematernal home earlier, and I'll go a little bit more in depth because I will also say I did not make up the name and I don't know who did, but the first time I heard it, I was like, what the heck is prematernal? Like, it bothered me. Sorry for whoever named it. I'm sure it was like, I'm sure some kind of thought was put into it, so not to like offend you if you're listening. No, Lisa, home birth wasn't on that chart. No, I'm not sure what the numbers are for home birth, but we do attend home births and people still do give birth at home, of course. I think in this presentation, we're most of the people, oh, and sorry, we'll also get to questions. Someone asked a question in the chat. We'll get to more questions at the end too. But most people in Alaska, or most Alaska Native people, are giving birth at hospitals, and the main hospital is the Alaska Native Medical Center. And so prematernal home, for those who are just listening in, it's I think maybe it started in YK, I believe, and that's Yukon-Kuskokwim part of Alaska, like the western region, and one of the regional medical care hubs, like the tribal I'm not sure actually, but it was a name for a home for people to stay at, like in Bethel, who were from the villages surrounding Bethel, because there's a hospital there. And in Barrow, there's also a hospital for the North Slope, which is a geographical region almost the size of the state of Wyoming. And there's only one hospital, and people can travel to Barrow or Utqiagvik and stay to give birth, but most of them actually go on to Anchorage. And there's a picture here of a purple house. That's where I lived, the prematernal home. So I had a room, and then there were 4 more rooms for people to come and stay at while they waited. So sometimes they would be there for 5 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer if there were medical issues. So like one family was there for a few months, or they might stay like overnight on their way to Anchorage and then have to go on to the hospital. And so it was nice actually to have this space. This is something I think that we're kind of missing in Anchorage, like a community space. There's a picture in the middle of 2 people on couches with birthing balls, and that's from the YK, the Bethel prematernal home. And people stay there, and there's community space, there's couches, there's a kitchen, and so there people can kind of gather and talk and not be so isolated in just one room. There's common gathering areas. But the overview of the process of giving birth in Alaska as a rural Alaskan is that you leave your community to the hub or urban center. And a lot of times, so many rural or most rural communities in Alaska don't have roads. You have to fly. And then to get to the airport, you might take a 4-wheeler or a snow machine, a boat, a small plane, and then to the jet. And then you take an urban bus or a taxi or a shuttle. So the image on the bottom here is of Alaska Native Medical Center with taxis out front. And an example would be that one mom who was staying with me here at this purple prematernal home was overdue by, I don't know, like 2 days. And her care providers at the hospital decided to send her to ANMC, to Alaska Native Medical Center, over 750 miles away on a commercial jet, a commercial Alaska Airlines plane, all by herself. I was so upset. So she landed all by herself. She landed and gave birth within an hour of the plane landing. So she barely made it to the hospital. There was really no need for her to be sent out. And it's just really hard. Like, they basically put her at risk of giving birth on an airplane because the flight was longer than the amount of time she had once the flight landed for her to get to the hospital. So there's a lot of issues too with getting in and out of rural villages. A lot of times there's weather delays, cancellations. There might not be flights for weeks at a time in rural Alaska if the weather's really bad. And then the same thing can happen in Anchorage, where people will get stuck because there's no planes leaving. A lot of times even Alaska Airlines flights can get grounded and the hotels can get full. And sometimes there's medevac planes. So if you're having a medical emergency, the medevac flight is a direct, like an air ambulance that will transport you from a hub straight to Anchorage. And that also happens. And then, of course, once you get to Anchorage, you're really lacking on that support. You have a home. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So while Alaska as a whole has some of the highest rates in the nation of community birth, of home and birth center choices, birth for Alaska Native people is almost always in a hospital setting, usually far away from their own communities, traditions, and practices. Sorry. And evacuation is effectively mandatory for rural pregnant people unless they're able to coordinate and pay out of pocket to host a home birth midwife. the displacement of Alaska Native parents happens despite the fact that as Indigenous people, we've been giving birth on our lands and waters for more than 10,000 years prior to colonization. And this evacuation happens despite the fact that the most valued resource reported by people during pregnancy and birth are other knowledgeable people from communities, despite research showing the continuous support of trained labor companion at birth results in shorter labors with fewer complications and reduced need for medical intervention. So it's really difficult for families to be forced to leave their communities. It's hard to understate how hard it is to leave your support system. So yeah, the next slide is a little bit about what we can do to support Alaska Native birthing families. So that's kind of the goal of our group, Alaska Native Birthworkers Community, also ANBC. We strive to do all these things, and our goal is that, and this is to share too, like what providers can do. So you can listen to people in your community, honor people's stories, center their experience, not your own. Become familiar with their cultures and histories, learn about cultural values, learn from elders, learn what you can in their language. Always try to learn how to say people's names. So if I go by my Inupiaq name and I say, hey, my name's Nungasuk, don't say, oh, that's so hard, I can't say that. Ask people what they want to be called and call them their name. That's so important. Get to know communities outside of the hospitals and clinics and participate in community events. If you're invited to, become familiar with structural impacts, structural racism, utilize trauma-informed and healing-centered care, acknowledge that traditions are best practices and that we have these best practices that have been developed for millennia in order to thrive on our lands and waters, and community-based solutions, not top-down cultural safety. So turn to the community to learn and support and acknowledge these families, and respect spaces that are created for Indigenous people in order to share, heal, and learn from each other. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Mo.
Okay, Basi Abra, Koinakbak. Yeah, just these questions to consider. This is kind of like what we reflect back to, some of the people involved in our healthcare, like thinking about who decides our birth options. How does the way we birth impact, maternal, child, family, and community health? What do these choices mean for our growing families and ourselves, individually, or like Alaska Native Birthworkers Community are not advocating for specific solutions or speaking on behalf of, rural birthing people in Alaska, ourselves being located in Anchorage where we, have these other options. And, I don't know that experience of what it's like to, be pregnant or in birth while living in my village. And also we, honor that we're, standing on the shoulders of all the tremendous tribal health advocates that have come before us and advanced us to where we are now, so that we are now in a place where we can ask these questions and think about them and continue to push forward, further. To collectively envision Alaska Native peoples as our most thriving and whole selves. Yeah, so rematriating, these are, photos from, many people and places that you all might recognize, people rematriating birth in their communities. So that's the end of our slides. We're really grateful for this time with you all and would like to open it up if anybody has any other questions.
I responded a little bit to a chat that says, I'm new to birth work and struggling with imposter syndrome and haven't been able to show up for mamas yet. And participating in these spaces helps me fuel my fire and reminds me why I'm walking this path. And I just want to really encourage you and say that I also can relate to what you're sharing, and that one thing that really helped me was just to show up in the same way that I would as a sister, an auntie, a friend. And it really doesn't even take, there is a lot of technical experience that can be applied in birth work settings. And in fact, Margaret and Abra and I were just in a meeting this morning where the birth worker who attended a birth yesterday, none of that technical expertise on like what position do I do for to coincide with baby station for engaging the pelvis, and they're like all of these things that we can learn as birth workers and apply technical knowledge to certain scenarios throughout any phase of labor. But sometimes all mamas want and need is for somebody to just stand beside them and to just be a witness for them and to hold space for them, to just be a loving, calming presence. And in the birth that was described, yesterday, the mom was like, didn't want to be touched, didn't even really want anybody like super close by, didn't need a lot of that technical stuff that can sometimes be overwhelming and have us thinking like, am I qualified enough for this? Or do I have the credentials that would make me suitable to be in this space? But just simply like being who we are as Native women and being in a space supporting other Native women is sometimes all it takes. And just walking into that room and being present is exactly what that person needs. So again, like a lot of us share sometimes like birth work chose me rather than I chose birth work and I got on this path. But like it really has found its way to us, and these families that we're really blessed to serve, they've found their way to us. And I like to think about how some of these situations, there's just absolute divine intervention. There was actually a birth that Margaret, Abra, and I all attended together for somebody who was 42 weeks. And there were periods of time when all three of us were out of town. And it was like everything aligned exactly the way it needed to be. And the timing was just perfect for that baby to be born when all three of us could be there. That felt like divine intervention. And like, that's just how it needed to happen. So just trusting that and having faith in that, and trusting that we'll be called into the places where we're needed is helpful. So I just wanted to respond to that and just offer a lot of encouragement for you as you continue on your path as a birth worker.
Yeah, also adding on to that, thanks for sharing, Lena. Part of, kind of like you were saying, just being there for people and holding space, like helping them to, feel more comfortable and safe, like in their environment. Another thing that we've noticed is just being there as a witness to the care that they're receiving in the facility impacts the quality of care that they receive. So again, even if we're not doing like the technical stuff, as a, birth helper or a doula, being present, like identified as somebody that, knows about birth, impacts the quality of their care. So it's kind of part of that like social justice role to being there as a witness.
There's another chat. Lisa just sharing that you're here because you want to listen and learn more about birth for people in Alaska. I just want to acknowledge that and just say thank you for coming to this space. We've given variations of this presentation for lots of providers, and we really love being able to share with folks who really want to learn about our community and how to serve our community. So I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that and for being here.
Also, Lisa had a question about home birth. Do you feel like that was answered when Abra was talking about that?
Yes, thank you. And Margaret mentioned some things in the chat that were helpful as well.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I just am requesting if you wanted to, Margaret, just say what you responded in the chat, just for the people who are in the future, because we tend to have a small audience to attend live, but hundreds of people listen later, and so your response about the home birth question, if that could be captured, that would be great.
Oh, sure. Yep. Sorry. So I think it came when we were showing this slide with that like graph of, over the last 30 years, just the number of births that were occurring at our tribal health facilities. So like how Abra was describing, like the way our system is set up, if somebody's in a village, they go to their regional hospital for birth for a normal healthy pregnancy. For any high risk reason, they're referred to Anchorage, so birth at the hospital in Anchorage. So that graph was, one line was showing the number of births at our regional tribal health hospitals. So that's Utqiagvik, Kotzebue, Nome, Bethel, Dillingham, which no longer has a labor and delivery unit open. So everybody from that region, like that whole like southwest region around Dillingham, even for normal pregnancies, even if it's their like fourth and fifth babies, they've had all their other babies in Dillingham, now have to come to Anchorage if they're receiving their care through the tribal health system. Sitka, Fairbanks, and then A&MC in Anchorage. And so what the graph was showing for people on the podcast is over the last 30 years, the total amount of births at all of those regional hospitals besides A&MC was like trending down, and the number of births at A&MC, the hospital in Anchorage, was trending up. And there was a question, is home birth captured on that chart? And it's not, because that was only showing the number of births through the tribal health system, and the Alaska Tribal Health System, or IHS, doesn't provide services or accommodate services for anything other than a hospital birth. So home birth midwives and birth center midwives aren't able to provide care like through the tribal health system. That tribal health system does have midwives in Alaska. We have a group of 20 midwives at the Alaska Native Medical Center. Kotzebue, which is one of the rural tribal health hospitals, has midwives. Fairbanks has midwives, and there's now a midwife in Utqiagvik, which is exciting. The rest of the tribal health hospitals, births are attended primarily by like family practice doctors, I think.
Could you speak to, though, like you're sharing the numbers of midwives and providers, but could you speak to the disparity of Alaska Native midwives and Alaska Native providers.
There's very few Alaska Native providers at all, as far as, like nurse practitioners, physicians. As far as I know, there aren't any, at this moment, there aren't any other Alaska Native midwives practicing in our tribal health system in Alaska. I know other Alaska Native midwives, like practicing in other places, but not in our tribal health system that I know of at this time. OB physicians, I know there's some Indigenous OB physicians in our system from other places. I don't know of any that are Alaska Native.
Yeah, I just wanted to have it be abundantly clear that not only are we removing people from their home, their community, their family, everything they know, and bringing them to the cities, but it's often a revolving door of providers, as Lena shared a bit of.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to capture that just absolutely clearly, and that's true in Alaska, and that's true of a lot of the Indian Health Services system, where it is non-native providers, and often people who are there short term for loan deferment and motivators like that, and that's a part of why having culturally centered care, culturally matched care, even in bits and pieces, even in, for tiny moments, can be so impactful, because it might be the only person in their prenatal experience that shares some very, essential cultural understandings.
Mm-hmm. Really quick about home birth. We said, on that slide too, that, Alaska is proud to share that we have like a high rate of community birth. But that's not accessible through our tribal health system. And knowledge of that option is not that prevalent. So it's kind of where we're like at in this work, is trying to raise community knowledge and awareness around options, and helping the demand for having different options come from the community. Oh, and one more thing about home birth midwives. So that was the kind of midwife I wanted to be. Like, I shared my birth story and made a very painful decision to pursue the certified nurse midwife pathway. Even though I knew, eyes open, I was going to be trained kind of in a more medical model way. But I chose that because of where we're at right now, that our health system only recognizes certified nurse midwives. And I wanted to practice where my community is right now. So Belen has a question, I believe. And
thank you. I just want to say I'm so grateful to be able to hear this conversation you all shared today. I'm so inspired by the type of sisterhood that you all created for each other to bring this healing services for the community. I have a deep prayer for my own community for this to kind of be planted and transpire as well, and for me to be able to become of a community like this. I think it alleviates a lot of that isolation and scary feelings when you have people backing you up. specifically, I have a sister here named Medium who I wanted to give thanks for just showing up for me in so many beautiful ways. I felt pretty lonely in my birth work journey just because what triggered me to go into this path was my son's birth, and it wasn't like it was a pretty traumatic experience giving birth to him right in the beginning of the pandemic, and not being able to have like that support makes me want to be that support for someone else, but also like coming from a place where like I've been needing to give that to myself. So also having that community, like I've literally shared space with Medium like twice in my life, but just online, you know, being inspired by her work. I'm so excited she's going to be a midwife for our community, and you know, just so inspired by her path. And for myself, I shared about the imposter syndrome, more specifically, more recently. I had a family member who was pregnant, and that's who I was kind of showing up for. And I wasn't her doula officially or anything like that, just as a family member showing up as an auntie, like you mentioned. And she was already 40 weeks in her gestational period, and she experienced the loss of her baby. And that was really abrupt and tragic, and it shook all of us. It shook her experience, and it also shook me as someone that was holding space for her. And it brought a lot of like doubt into, you know, my medicine and what I was able to offer. And thankfully, I had Medium there who like reached out and asked me about her, and I was able to tell her what I was going through, and she kind of gave me some really good advice, some really true, raw, real advice that I would love to maybe hear from you guys, like how you deal with that in terms of, you know, showing up for those families. And also myself, like in this path, I've done my doula training, and it's all mostly been online because of the pandemic. And so now I'm really looking forward to doing more in-person trainings. That I think I'm a hands-on learner, and I think when I get to that point, I'm going to build more confidence. But the financial aspect's been hard because I gave birth since the pandemic. I haven't returned to work. So my question to you all is, if I'm so inspired by how you're, you know, receiving grants to provide these services for like underprivileged families. And I'm wondering if you yourself have found financial assistance to get those trainings, like those hands-on trainings. A lot of the financial assistance I have found, it's like you have to be in a UC or in a college, and that's where the funding goes. It's not really like to learn, you know, from a person, traditional birth work. So I'm wondering if you guys have experience in finding that abundance to be able to fill your own cup to then serve your community in those ways. And I'm just so grateful for everything you said, especially Elena, like the words you mentioned, and knowing like you're so well put together and already such a service to your community. And the fact that you experience this yourself just like humbles me and makes me remember that this path is like a humbling path. And it's always, you know, you're a lifelong learner and a student. So thank you for that reminder. And again, Medium, I love you and I'm so grateful for you.
I can just respond and share that one of the things I really love and appreciate about our community is the practice of bartering. So, you know, where there might be like cash limitations for certain things, there's still, I think, what I've observed, like the healthy practice of bartering services still. So I think if there were an Indigenous birth worker training that you really wanted to go to, but maybe it's cost prohibitive, or you know of others who might want to participate in a training that's cost prohibitive, seeing you know, what kind of options there might be to participate outside of a cash transaction. Like, is there another way that you can be a helper at the training, or is there something that you have to offer that could be helpful to cover that? And Abra mentioned that we've been really fortunate with our grant funding to try to make our trainings all free of charge, because we know that access is an issue. Access to training, access to credentialing, access to our own information can be challenging. And there's these barriers to entry for people to get into birthwork positions where we're desperately needed. So our organizing has been to really try to to lower those barriers to entry and make the opportunities that we provide really accessible to people, even including like paying for their travel and their accommodations, so that we're not always Anchorage centric and that people can come from the villages if they want to. So that's been kind of our model of offering care. But for me as an individual, like, I've not participated in trainings because it was too expensive, but I know now, like, it can't hurt to ask, is there something that I can offer or exchange of value to be able to, hey Telebabes, to be able to do this. Yeah, we do have some back-to-back meetings lined up. Abra had to go because she had another meeting that started at 1. But I think for any further questions, you guys are welcome to contact us through our website, nativebirthworkers.org. You can email us, nativebirthworker@gmail.com, or reach out to us through our social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and we'd love to connect with folks. Thank you again, Basit, Rhonda, for hosting us, and for everyone who joined today.
Basit.
Hi,
Bye.
Tana. I think it's great that she's closing our meeting.
Auntie Rhonda.
Hi, sweetheart.